Everybody. Thanks for coming to this panel. I know we're conflicting with happy hour here, so we'll try to be as entertaining and informative as possible. My name's Alyson Klein. I'm a reporter at Education Week, where I cover technology, the future of work, and student wellness. So it's been a busy couple of years. No one here needs me to tell them that the pandemic shook up K-12 education as we've known it. We all saw that schools were forced to close and shift over to virtual instruction in a matter of days in many cases. We've all heard or experienced firsthand the virtual learning nightmare stories and successes. And we know that COVID threw inequities we have always known existed in the K-12 system into stark relief. Some see the past 2 years as essentially wasted time. But others say some of the things we tried during COVID provided the kind of circuit breaker that gave us a chance to reimagine K-12. So how can we use the pandemic as an opportunity to better serve economically disadvantaged kids and prepare everyone for the needs of a rapidly shifting workforce? Is a return to normal a positive step, a missed opportunity, or a little bit of both? With us to unpack those big questions, we have an amazing panel of policymakers and practitioners. They all have impressive bios, but I'm just going to do quick introductions so that we can get right to the conversation. Scott Frauenheim is the CEO of Distinctive Schools, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting and accelerating the work of charters. Phyllis Lockett is the CEO of Leap Innovations, an organization headquartered in Chicago that connects innovation and education to transform how kids learn. And Chris Rush is the Senior Advisor for Innovation and Improvement in the Office of the Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. He also co-founded New Classrooms Innovation Partners, which is a nonprofit focused on new instructional models. So thanks to all of you for joining us. So for all of you out there, we are doing questions from the audience through the Slido app, which you can all find in your South by Southwest app. And I believe there are folks around who can help you if you're confused by any of that. So I will just jump right into the first question, which will be for everyone. We're on what we hope is the downhill slope of the strangest moment in K-12 education in memory. There's a push now to return to normal. And I'm wondering, is a return to normal the right approach? And we'll start with you, Scott.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Excited to be here. Return to normal, no, all capital letters. I think many of us are on the same page there in the way that we are reimagining and thinking about going back to something very different. I think that's been hard to do as we navigate what is reality right now with reopening of schools, with COVID contact tracing and being able to identify rolling closures and everything else that's been distracting us, including the mask debate and everything else that's really fueling a lot of frustration and fatigue across our schools. But I think this is an opportunity and a silver lining or a spark to really think about the ability to stop, reassess, and have some fun with the ability to redesign. So a lot of our personalized learning work that we've been doing over the past 10 years in partnership with Leap Innovations has really led us to be designers and to think about design thinking in really exciting ways. We were inspired by a video by Bettina Love. If anybody has not seen that video yet, Google it, around not going back to normal. And she reminded us, wait, overnight we sent devices home where districts haven't been willing to do that. We are doing empathy interviews. We are doing parent listening conferences. All of those trends that emerged, I think, were the spark in the beginning, and I think we need to make sure that we're capitalizing on those as we return to school and making sure that we're not going back to normal as fast as possible.
Wholeheartedly agree with Scott. No back to normal. Normal wasn't working before. When we think about the inequities that existed in our school system for decades, when we think about the challenge of lack of preparation, remediation of half of our students, particularly Black and brown students, who were even able to get to college. We can't go back to normal. This should be a clarion call for all of us to reimagine what learning can look like in the future. I saw a startling statistic from a McKinsey report recently that said, due to the unfinished learning that has impacted this generation of students, its impact on our economy could be upwards of $188 billion every year this generation enters the workforce. So we have to rethink how we design learning, how we design learning that is going to enhance our students' preparation, but also support our education workforce in very different ways than we have done before.
Well, so that we don't have a group that just all says, yes, back to normal, or agrees with everything, I'll play devil's advocate for a moment and say that I don't think it's just about going back to normal. Like, we want to get back to a normal, because I don't think we want to keep doing this, right? Because it's exhausting everybody. It's exhausting parents, it's exhausting students, it's exhausting teachers, it's everybody in the system. It's taxed, it's overly taxed. And if we just go back to business as usual, then we're going to continue to leave more and more people behind realistically, because that gap, there is some lost learning time that's happened. There are folks who are further behind. And I think we need to get to a new normal, and we need to try to get there as quickly as we can, but not backsliding to what we were doing before. The reality is, if in some subject areas, that unfinished learning has real consequences, because the learning is it builds upon itself. So if you are in mathematics and you start missing how to work with fractions and how to work with triangles, you are going to suffer as you go forward if you don't actually figure out the right way to catch up. We can't just remediate students either. We need to build ladders from where they are to where they need to be, and we need to allow that to happen over multiple years. We're not going to make up 2 or 3 years worth of loss, with 2 days a week after school for 2 or 3 months at the end of the year, or just in a summer school program. But in other subject areas, social studies, for example, you may be able to skip some of that content and be able to sort of continue where you were. So I think there's a balance, and I think we need to look at it in a non-binary way and really be more strategic as we look at different subjects, at different grade levels, at different ages, and figure out how we really meet students where they are and how we build those ladders to success.
Thank you for those thoughtful answers. I know, Phyllis, that you said you were on team let's not return to normal. Normal wasn't working. But in what ways do you think a return to normal could, be somewhat beneficial? And how would returning to normal hurt kids and teachers?
So let's be clear, an all remote learning scenario did not work. So the notion that we need to get, thank goodness our kids are back in school. We're hopefully again seeing the end of this pandemic. As a friend of mine says, Omicron needs to be Omegon. So we're all excited about that. And the social and emotional learning and trauma that our kids have experienced during this time frame is unprecedented. In fact, I heard another certainly statistic a few weeks ago that about half of U.S. high schoolers will be diagnosed with a mental health disorder. That's a problem. When we think about the foundational elements of relationship building and sense of belonging that is critical for our students to learn. You can't do that in a remote context. So that is huge. And all the schools that we've been working with are doing tremendous work on social and emotional learning and development and reestablishing those foundational relationships. I think where it can hurt is we are seeing, again, a loss of decline of enrollment across this country. It was happening again before the pandemic, but every major city is reporting a decline. I know in Chicago, where I work, it was about 14,000 students lost in the year of the pandemic. This year is still 10,000 students lost. If we again just return to normal, we are not going to engage students. We have got to figure out how to re-enlist their passion, their interest, and their connection to school in a very different way than just the traditional context of how we delivered learning in the past.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, kind of getting a little more into the weeds, what are some of the practices, some of the specifics that emerged during the pandemic that might help K-12 schools move in this different direction, better tailor instruction for schools? And I had never heard that 50% mental health disorder, and maybe help serve social and emotional needs. Scott, this is a perfect question for you.
Yeah, so a major focus on social emotional learning and mental health, and it has to be and had to be the foundation of everything that we were doing in our classrooms, everything that we were doing remote. Obviously, a major practice that emerged for us was our devices going home and our students flipping to an entirely remote environment. I do believe that there was a benefit to our teachers zooming into homes, zooming into families, being able to really identify some of the hardships that our historically marginalized communities were feeling day by day in the middle of this pandemic, let alone on top of that, the racial inequity that we saw during this time that so many of our students across the country and the world were experiencing. And so the social emotional learning strategies I think that are emerging are well needed and were needed prior to the pandemic, embedded fully in everything that we do and not just a place and time in our schools. But I also think it created an opportunity for teachers to understand the importance of the equity work and the social emotional learning work for our students. I think that practice has really elevated teachers, hopefully advocating more and more for the reason why we're doing this equity work and the reason why it's important, where maybe they could not have seen the hardships or the trauma that so many of our students were experiencing in their classrooms. I also think the family engagement that we saw, the support from our parents and our families and the way that they were engaging with us, we saw, and teachers reported much stronger relationships than they had with students just in their classrooms. Teacher and student relationships have reported very high on all of our culture surveys from being remote, which I think was powerful, and we're hoping all of those relationships now transition back into the classroom and finding the balance of promoting social emotional learning and mental health, obviously investing in additional staff members that we're realizing that we need as an emerging practice back on campuses, but hopefully bringing those relationships back into the classrooms to really propel the balance of social emotional learning, but also the learning acceleration that we know we need to do from the missed learning.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I chime in on
Absolutely.
one addition there? I also think one of the biggest things that I've heard, and one of the honors and privileges that I have in my role is getting to talk to so many districts and schools across the country as they've been going through this. And one of the big things that I've heard from students in particular is that during the pandemic, for the first time, many folks felt like their teachers actually listened to their context and the challenges that they were having, and were able to sort of make accommodations to set them up to be more successful. And it's the number one thing, not formally on a survey, but it's the number one thing I'm hearing anecdotally from students and parents that they're hoping does persist. That idea that what is going on in the rest of their life matters, and that there is a way to marry the learning with their reality, and to have that continue to not only feel like somebody cares about your context, about your situation, about you being successful, instead of just saying sort of deal with it, adapt to school. I think that's a huge practice to figure out how do we bottle that? How do we replicate that? How do we systematize that so teachers don't get taken advantage of, the system doesn't get taken advantage of, but we can actually sort of connect with students systemically and drive them towards success.
Yeah, thank you for that. Teachers hate this phrase, but we are constantly hearing about learning loss. How much addressing that issue inform schools' work over the next few years? But then how important should it be to catch kids up academically versus dealing with their social emotional needs? What should be the priority? I mean, we've heard some really striking statistics from Phyllis, the billions of dollars lost to the economy, but then also 50% of high schoolers being diagnosed with a mental health condition. Those are two huge imperatives. We'll start with Scott on that one.
Yeah, so I think like many of us, we are moving towards the more asset-based, discussion and language of learning acceleration, and really being able to identify the appropriate scaffolding for our students in all subject areas as we think about just-in-time or just-right instruction for our students, aligning to grade level standards and making sure that we're not going back to a remediation or a skill and drill world. I think that is going to be a huge opportunity for us as school districts and teachers and staff to really think about how we don't go back to that as we think about not going back, and we really think about learning acceleration. We've got a great partnership at Distinctive Schools with TNTP, and they really helped us get prioritized on what was most important with learning acceleration, our DEI work, and our social emotional learning work, and really helping us just stay focused on those three things and making sure that we've got relevant professional learning for our teachers to make sure that they can keep up with the work that we're asking them to do. It's a lot of different planning structures in place for us to really think about learning acceleration and the way that we're scaffolding within standards to make sure that we've got the just-in-time and just-right instruction, and also supporting with interventionists now with a very different focus of making sure that we're pushing students as far as we can and as best as we can. I think we talked about this a little bit, but there has to be a balance between the SEL work and the learning acceleration work because they can't happen without each other, and we're finding that. We are hearing from our teachers and our staff that we just have to provide them resources. We're proud of our guaranteed viable curriculum that we use in all subject areas, but our SEL resources were definitely lacking. We've been honest about that in the way that we were making it a priority before the pandemic. We've got a partnership with Move This World that's just been phenomenal in the way that we're providing teachers resources to be able to really implement the SEL strategies into the day, and asking teachers to do that and making sure that engaging and relevant PD also accompanies that. And we just cannot ask teachers to go open source find their own SEL resources and curriculum if we want them to do it well and respond to the mental health that we're seeing with emerging behaviors across our campuses with students coming back for the first time.
Yeah, if I could jump
Absolutely.
in on this one, there's been plenty of research out there that again says that relationships are the foundation to academics. You can't do one without the other. And, I think again, and Chris has noted, this notion of thinking about academics and accountability absent of SEL is a misnomer. It's not a choice. So our school is going to focus on SEL. No, it has to be whole child. I think we've been talking about this for years. It really came to bear front and center during COVID. And so, again, school historically has not been designed to contend with both, but it has to be integrated. That is core to our framework at LEAP as we think about learning has to be centered on the needs, interests, and strengths of every single student, and that has to be embedded in the practice, in the design of the classroom, in the deployment of teaching and learning. And I will say, building on Chris's point, the schools that were doing and implementing these practices, like Distinctive Schools and others that we've worked with, and many that I've talked to across the country, saw or experienced more resiliency during COVID. The fact that they already had systems and structures set up to do those empathy walks, to have the protocols to go deep in understanding the context of each learner. Schools who had the constructs of a student's personalized learning pathway established, they were able to take those systems and structures and move them in a remote setting in a much more agile way than schools that were operating in a traditional context.
Yeah, just to build upon what Phyllis is saying there, I think sometimes the idea of new learning models, of reimagining what's happening in the classroom, it can be scary. Sometimes it can be hard, and to be honest, like I was saying before, lots of people are tired. It's a hard moment to look at some of that. And what I think we need to be careful of is just sort of putting wrapping paper on it, or the expression lipstick on a pig, right? Like the idea of just saying like, here's how we were doing it, and I'm gonna like check that SEL box, I'm gonna say I'm doing whole child, and then it's gonna not necessarily work because you're not embedding it sort of in the core of what's happening. And I think there's a unique opportunity in this moment that we need to balance both the fatigue that people feel, but also seize that opportunity. And I just want to name that opportunity in terms of learning loss here, which again is a controversial term sometimes because it doesn't mean the kids actually went backwards. It's much more lost learning time from what they need to do. But the reality here is that prior to the pandemic, if you were running a school and you acknowledged that your 7th graders or your 9th graders were 3 years behind, 4 years behind, there was a real penalty that happened there. There was, well, you weren't doing your job. What was happening? There wasn't sort of permission to fully acknowledge or admit that loss, that the students were behind. It suggested you were doing something that was problematic. There is a window here for the next, what I wish was just the next maybe 18 months, but who knows what's going to happen with the pandemic. So anywhere from 18 months to sort of like 4 or 5 years here, where there's a window of acknowledgement, of blame-free opportunity to acknowledge where kids are and to actually dive in to tackle them. Does that mean, at the beginning of March, that has to be what everybody does? But really, to the degree we can, yes. But people, I hope, take the summer, take a break, regroup, and can come back and hit the ground hard in the fall in trying to figure out how to take best advantage of that opportunity to do right by as many students as we possibly can.
Yeah, thank you for that. So if you were advising schools, which actually all of you do, what are the 2 strategies that you would consider urging them to adopt in the wake of the pandemic? And I'll start with Scott on that question and move to Phyllis.
Okay, 2 things right now that I think are most important for us and for a lot of the schools across Chicago and Michigan that we work with closely. One is community hubs. And really thinking about community hubs through engagement. And so we realized and had highlighted for us what our communities need most from us and being a true community partner in a school. And I think for us, being totally honest and vulnerable here, we lost sight of that a bit prior to the pandemic, with a deep focus on protecting and focusing on what was inside our 4 walls. Being able to provide food access, being able to provide healthcare access, being able to provide vaccines, being able to make sure that we have financial literacy for parents. We were getting home access for so many of our families that couldn't afford rent and other things during this pandemic. And so that it really motivated us and inspired us to bring what we know our communities need back into our schools and truly being the best community partner to our families, to our students, to our stakeholders. And it's been really inspiring to think about community partners that want to find ways to help us and not sure really how to help us. And just by asking many community partners, we've got health clinics going into some of our schools. We've got mobile banking that's showing up to open bank accounts. We've got lots of those partnerships that we just lost sight of during the pandemic and maybe didn't have a focus on prior to that. And so I think community hub focus and innovation and ideation has been really powerful and fun in response to the fatigue. And I also just remind us to design with, for, and by our teachers, our students, our staff, our families, our stakeholders, the ESSER funds, the Moving Forward Together funds, creating focus groups, creating stakeholder groups to make sure that you're getting and we are getting the buy-in that we need from our communities to be able to make sure that the decisions we're making, the priorities that we are making, first and foremost here, and the funding that will flow to those priorities, we have buy-in and we have support from our community as we do this together, because it's only sustainable if we've got everyone's support and buy-in in those 2 areas.
Yeah, I hear that. Phyllis, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd say that we need to remember that learning transcends time and place. We've proved that learning can happen. Now, all learning didn't happen perfectly, but the notion that learning can happen at home, in the community with partners, is really important. And especially as we think about this recovery and the fatigue that has been placed on our educators and our schools, that, how can we leverage a broader community of resources to support the unfinished learning of our students? How do we leverage parents? A number of our schools have created parent pods and engage parents. I mean, let's keep that. That is awesome. Parents have been were thrust into their kids' learning, good, bad, or indifferent. How do we continue that effort, because it does require an all hands on deck moment and opportunity to extend learning, to think about how we can complement kind of the learning ecosystem as a support around each school and each educator to support our students.
And to build on the what are the blockers, right? I see there's some questions popping in about how do you get buy-in from various folks to participate in this, how do we handle it at this moment of fatigue, but I also want to build upon the funding opportunities that exist, because it's a unique moment on that front too. There are multiple relief funding packages with the ARP dollars that are floating around out there, and one of the things I hear from time to time is, well, can I do that? It's not an allowable use of funds. I haven't found the thing yet that someone's had a credible, tangible idea about that you can't actually use those funds for. It might be tricky in there. It might be like, how do you look at it in the regulations? I'm going to just call out, we did a Q&A we put out, and in answers A10 and A22 should be everything you need to do any real idea that you have. But I just want to invite the audience that if you have a real idea, if you think there's something that can make a difference and you don't think you can use the dollars to be able to do that, I invite you to reach out to me and folks at the department, because we will try to help you, because we believe that you are set up, at least on that front, so that it becomes much more about how do you do it within your community, how do you do it with your staff, how do you do it with your teachers. But I really want to emphasize a term that they were just using as well, and I want to say with. When you try to do new things, hopefully innovation is not something that's happening to you. It doesn't feel oppressive in that way, but it's something that's happening with you. So the question that I know, there's one that someone just submitted about getting the buy-in from teachers, parents, local communities. You have to do it with them. You have to hear the challenges. You have to tackle the priorities that they're worried about and do it with them and share in that effort. And that's how you get real buy-in on some of that stuff.
And I can add to that. Innovation design sessions has been something that's been very motivating, especially during this contentious time. Community members, family members, students, staff, leaders, all invited to really think about innovation design sessions, creating blueprints from our personalized learning work of transforming classrooms, and using that entire model to think about how we're going to spend funds and what big projects or ideas people may have aligned to our priorities. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, social emotional learning, and learning acceleration are our big three. And so we're inviting folks to really think about pitch sessions. We're thinking about crowdsourcing. We're thinking about making it as fun as possible in the most tiring time right now to get that excitement going and to build that motivation for folks to really engage. It's a lot of extra work and it's a lot of extra time, but it's going such a long way to get that excitement and that spark back.
Thank you for that. So this next question, I'll start with Chris. We got through what we think is probably the worst of the pandemic, we hope, thanks to technology, right? So what could be technology's role in transforming K-12 for the better? We're always hearing from the ed tech community that that's something that technology can be, not a silver bullet, but an incredible help. And what did we find out are the limitations of technology?
Yeah, well, we could do a whole panel session just on that particular question about the benefits of technology, and some of my colleagues are doing some other sessions on ed tech in particular, so I invite you all to take a look at some of those. But I will say on the high level, I think we paint too broad a picture with technology. Like, is remote learning good? Is remote learning bad? It goes into these binary things that we tend to do not only in education, but we're doing more and more as a society. The reality is, look, I used to lead the office of of technology at the department. I've been an ed tech person for the last 15, 20 years of my life, and I don't want my kids to only learn with technology, okay? But it doesn't mean that part of the time there is not value to technology that's happening there. And I think when we get into the full dosage, technology-only questions, that probably is applicable to a smaller portion of the population. But the reality is there's only so much in-classroom learning time. We have students who need to make up ground. We have students who need opportunities to really explore and engage in their interests. And I think we can have in-classroom learning time partnered with out-of-class learning time, whether or not that's technology-based, whether or not that's involving yourself in community activities and other entities that exist in your community, whether or not that's environmental centers, nature centers, museums, libraries, internships. I think we can put it all together, but I think we need to make learning more interesting, more engaging for folks, and I think technology has a role with that. And the second thing I would highlight to this is also the space about broadening the group that's involved in that education. So it's always largely been the teacher and the student, and maybe some of the other students in the room. But we can have parent communities that are involved. We can have parents that are involved in those activities. We can have instructional materials that are set up for parents who want to take it further. I think the opportunity to go beyond the classroom, not replacing the classroom, but to go beyond and extend the classroom is a huge opportunity that I hope is what we can. If there's one huge learning legacy that comes from the pandemic, I hope it's that.
I was just going to build on that, Chris's excellent points. You know, I think technology is going to continue to be a game changer, never replacing school, but a transformative game changer as we think about learning in the future. So, you know, first of all, the massive amount of dollars and resources that went into equalizing the digital divide I mean, everyone who in this room and who was instrumental in that response, should be applauded. I mean, that was long overdue. Not saying that we're not fully there yet, but the notion of access, right, has been addressed in ways that we've never seen in the history of public education, and that has to continue. We've got to think about what we're preparing, or what world are we preparing our students for? A digital age. I mean, the digitization of our society has accelerated under COVID. And so if we're serious about really preparing our students for a fast-changing economy that is anchored on technology, we've got to be thinking about how we are preparing our students to learn for that future economy. And technology, it has to have a place. One of the things we're seeing is, another challenge that's accelerated is attrition among our educator workforce because of the burnout and fatigue. Again, that was happening before, but it's accelerated subsequent to COVID. And we are seeing technology being an opportunity, or creating an opportunity for schools to broaden their footprint. We talked about engaging students differently, and so there's a limited amount of courses or opportunities that any one school can create. It's largely limited to the social capital or resources that a school happens to have. Well, technology can open up a world of learning opportunities for our students to learn everywhere, and to learn and actually bringing resources into the school that they may not have historically had access to. So I think we have to, again, give ourselves the permission to be imaginative, to be creative, to try new things in this world of technology.
Yeah, I think having the devices and being an innovative network for us was really powerful. So we had digital fluency skills. Our students, we used to celebrate if our first graders were making PowerPoints, and now they're blowing us away with what they've done over the past 2 years. I think more credit to those that did not have devices or one-to-one in the beginning and were able to turn, like Phyllis said. But I do think that, all of us, or some of us may agree that, relationships cannot be replaced by the technology. And so finding that balance of live, in-person, engaging instruction, also the technology that led to more collaboration while we were gone. I also think that our partners, our digital program solutions and providers, stepped up in huge ways, because if we did not have those programs and we did not have those opportunities for students to engage, I think we would have left even bigger holes for our students to really engage with us on a daily basis. I think the technology is really, really, really going to become needing to be replaced, because we're seeing lots of devices come back broken and damaged, and so we really need to think about sustainability plans for our own devices. I think teachers saw incredible ways to personalize. We keep saying that our teachers just were rapidly developing as fast as they could in this time because they had to, and there was obviously limitations to that, but the development that we were able to provide them and the growth that we saw our teachers have on the devices and on technology and in a personalized learning way was incredible. I think some of the limitations that we saw were the screen time that I think we all know is affecting many of our students, and some of the mental health correlation to that screen time, as well as just our infrastructure for supporting so many devices that wasn't ever present before COVID. Safety monitoring, being able to identify what students are doing all day on their devices, and again, being able to support from an infrastructure standpoint, breakage, problems, issues, corrective actions on the devices, I think is a huge limitation that we need to solve for still, even bringing the devices back in with a focus on anytime, anywhere learning.
Yeah, so it kind of supercharged those problems that we already had. Speaking of problems we already had, we've known for decades, of course, that K-12 education has some big inequities. But the pandemic really brought those disparities into stark relief. Did that conversation, shift? Did the conversation on equity shift anywhere? Was there change in any of the school districts? Has it gone far enough? And what might happen going forward? So, Phyllis, do you want to start us off with that?
Well, sure. I mean, we touched on the inequities of access to technology. I'm really proud that most of the schools that we work with, school districts across the country, are having important conversations about equity and how equity shows up in teaching and learning and the curriculum. It's just foundationally important, again, as we think about relationships, trust building being the core for a foundation for learning academically, we've got to understand and value the identity and the full self of every child that shows up. And so you can't deliver in this context without equity or without having kind of an equity lens in mind. So, I think this is again a moment, as one can call it whole child or SEL or personalized learning, that this is a moment in which I think the sector is going to shift dramatically and will not go back to the way it was, which I think is a really positive thing. The center of the whole child, understanding every student, is foundational.
I think equity has obviously been a topic for us for the past 2 years in the way that we are focusing on it. And I want to give a shout out to all the equity champions in the room who are continuously fighting and advocating to make sure that equity is at the forefront for all of our students across the world. And we know, I was talking to a superintendent earlier today, to be unnamed, but she really inspired me with a comment that she made that she said, critical race theory and the equity work and the contentious times right now, and it's so hard. And she said it's equity is belonging, and everybody deserves to belong. And so I think that the pandemic has definitely highlighted that for all of us. And the equity work and the belonging work is so important in the way that we recover together, because if people do not feel like they belong, they are not going to want to engage with us. And so I think the more that we can all collectively push the equity work through our innovation and our redesign, it's going to be so important, especially related to the racial injustice that we saw and continue to see on top of the pandemic trauma that we all experienced.
Yeah, I hear that. Chris, did you have anything to add before I go to my final question?
Well,
it's okay if the answer is no.
Well, now that critical race theory came up, it's just the perfect time to chime in from the federal
Let's
perspective.
try not to go down that rabbit hole.
No, but the one thing I would add there is that I think it's important to recognize that sometimes focusing on equity is uncomfortable and can be scary to various folks on there. Because does that mean my son or daughter might not get something else because somebody else is getting it? There's fear out there that there can be some zero sum, or that because maybe I'm a little more well-to-do, I'm going to have to pitch in differently, and my son or daughter is going to pay the price for that. And I think the one message I would put out there is just that we need to have some understanding and some awareness that different people hear that word very differently, and that if we don't leave room for that, if we don't leave room to understand some of those alternate perspectives and understand realistically the fears that come up with some of these thoughts and terms, that we're not going to see that dramatic change that Phyllis has been talking about, because we start working against each other rather than with each other. And so I think equity is tremendously important, and I think we need to be very mindful and hear what different folks in the community think and feel and fear about it.
All right. Thank you all for that. I'm going to ask one more moderator question, and then we'll go to your questions. What do you all see as the biggest impediment right now to using the pandemic as a moment to bring up positive change in K-12 schools? And just so that we don't end on a bummer note, if you can tell me what you think, if there is something, is really helping, what's helping to spur change or could help spur change. And I'll let anybody take that who wants.
I think we've named some of them. I'll start with fatigue. Yeah. Everyone's tired. We're all tired. Every single day is tiring. Our principals, who many of you are maybe in the room, are substitute teaching on the daily. We're covering classrooms. We are dealing with a staffing shortage. We've got some contention, and we all want the best for our kids. And it's so hard to stop and find time to be able to plan and pick our heads up and look ahead with that strategic mindset that so many of us have been wanting and urging our teams to do. And so, I'm constantly thinking about how do we find time and space to get teams away, to be able to really think about, in retreat style and design thinking style, how do we stop and look ahead and reassess what we need to do to be able to recover. I also think accountability could be an impediment, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole either, but really being thoughtful about the permission right now to really take risks and to think big and to be bold. I think one impediment could be, skill and drill, remediation, get back, state assessments, school performance, and I think if we all collectively say we're going to stand up and take some risks together, then we can do this as a country and we can do this as a world in the way that we recover together. But fatigue and accountability right now need to be wiped out of the way with some inspiration and some excitement and really getting people to have some fun with the redesign of what's possible.
Here, Scott. I think, at the broader level and at the district level, I mean, Michael Horan talks about this threat rigidity, right? That, when we face a big threat, what do? You fight against it and you get back to, again, normal, right? You get back to what you are most comfortable doing. And we've got to resist that. Right? I mean, it's a natural response, but we need to resist the threat and have a moment I think, again, there's a social and emotional learning construct for educators, honestly, that we need to be talking about in addition to our students. But to have that moment of release and reset is going to be really, really important. One of the other big threats is, again, it's accountability for sure. Again, I'm hoping that, again, in COVID, we had to think past the traditional accountability system because we couldn't fully implement it. So how is that broadening our perspective on what should a accountability system of the future entail? Certainly not all high stakes tests, and certainly not just focus on academics. How do we think about measuring the advancement of social and emotional learning skills, of 21st century learning skills, and how that is, those competencies are expressed in the full complement of how we are thinking about preparing our students. So those are some of the things that are absolutely on my mind. And of course, I want to get rid of seat time. I talk to my friend.
I was waiting for seat time
all the time. Can we get past seat time? I mean, one of the things that I'm most excited about is what New Hampshire is doing with Learn Everywhere, where they have taken this moment and opportunity to partner with the broader community. The robotics teams with Boys and Girls Club to enable credit for those experiences that kids are learning and where they're pursuing their interests. Again, a community-wide call to action for how we're going to help our students recover. So that's, again, looking for those bright lights and how we can elevate this innovation and call to action at this time. Does God agree with me?
Yeah. So, two thoughts. One, in response to some of the things that were brought up, whether or not the seat time, accountability. I think there are a lot of mechanisms out there that are double-edged swords, in the sense that there are ways that accountability can be a challenge for things that are happening, but there are things that accountability is protecting and putting in place as well. I think there are challenges that come with seat time. At the same time, there are some benefits that come with seat time. One thing I would encourage us all to think about is that when there's something that's becoming an impediment to what's happening, think about what it's solving for, and not just say, let's get rid of this, but figure out another way that we solve for what it's bringing, but also can minimize some of the impediments that are there. But more directly to your question about the future and how we go forward in this way, and what might actually block us, I think the things that have the biggest chance to block us right now are also our biggest opportunities to make a change. So from that, and therefore you can be optimistic or pessimistic about these things, but reality, there are staffing shortages on the horizon, and there are some folks who think that's just during the pandemic time, and that as soon as the pandemic goes away, that will go away. The surveys out there are saying something different, that a lot of teachers and educators and administrators are holding on because they don't want to leave their schools and communities in a lurch, and that when things get back to normal with that, then they're going to leave. And I think that can be a real challenge because it means you will have less qualified people in classrooms driving instruction. That can be a big challenge for what's going to come. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, if we decide to not fight it, to not ignore it, but to look that challenge straight in the eye and say, what are we going to do about it? And we turn to our teachers and our educators that are frustrated and they're looking to leave the system or make a change and say, what if you had a magic wand? What if you had carte blanche for a moment? What are the things that you think could make a difference here? And we start evolving what we're going to do with them. Then I think we will see an evolution of the role of teachers and educators. We will see less people starting to leave in the places where folks are doing that, and we can get to a healthier system overall. But it's all in what we make of this moment. But the opportunity is the fact that we aren't going to be able to fully go back to normal, quote unquote, whatever that is. There are going to be more challenges. And where there are challenges, you know what they say, like necessity is the mother of all invention. The more there are new challenges right now, the better, the more likely it is that we will actually rise together and find a way to overcome them.
All right, so I'm going to go to your questions. And I have a confession. I'm actually pretty nearsighted, so I'm going to just get a little closer to be able to ask them. First question, what changes in teacher support, and this goes to what you were just talking about, Chris, do you think will be needed to ramp up tech use in schools as you've described? And that can be for anybody who's interested in talking about it.
I'm happy to jump in and then turn it and be like, well, we got to stop thinking of training, whether or not it's about tech training or whole child learning or social emotional, as this idea that we're going to do it on an in-service day on election day or something like that. And then you can just be knocked out in 45 minutes or in 4 hours one day. We're going to have to embed it into what's happening. We have to think of teaching and learning as an ongoing endeavor. And we actually have to make it part of folks' work. Not just say, if you don't use PowerPoint, if you don't use this tool, you're going to get in trouble. But how do we actually use it to solve the problems that people are experiencing? And in that case, it becomes not about the in-service day. It becomes something that helps them do their job. In the sense that, essentially the entire teaching force now knows how to use Zoom. And it wasn't because they were spending time in in-service days. It's because they had to use it, and it was part of their work, and it was going to be more helpful. The number of folks who know how to use Google Classroom and other LMSs has increased dramatically because it was just part of their work. If we embed it in part of the learning models of what's happening and provide some of those additional supports, we'll see some of that transformation. But as long as we keep treating it as like wrapping paper or icing on the cake of what's happening, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, totally agree there in the way that it needs to be embedded everywhere. I think in response to day-to-day, we're really thinking about our staffing model differently, where we went from sharing, technology specialists from, 2 to 3 buildings to every building potentially needing one, and schools advocating for that so that they can have more resources for teachers and students on demand throughout the day. And obviously from a COVID standpoint, we're looking at student-led groups for how they're supporting us with our technology. We're looking at partnerships with consulting firms that are really focused on technology integration in schools and the way that we're getting better. We need better platforms. We talk about that a lot, and the way that we're bringing all of our information together for teachers, because for many teachers, they're still logging into 26 tabs for one class period to be able to process their work. And then we're also thinking about really rethinking the technology specialist role and thinking about some of our best teachers in the way that we can create leadership pipelines beyond just the instructional coach leadership role, to really think about technology specialists as leaders in buildings, and creating that opportunity for teachers to really think about the instructional design component of what we're asking teachers to do with instructional planning, which is looking a lot different. And so how can a technology specialist join a planning session with instructional coach, school leader, teacher, or group of teachers at the same time?
I think there's also an opportunity of changing the requirements, dare I say the accreditation requirements of schools of education.
I see you looking at me.
I'm
like
looking
I
at you because you're sitting at the USDOE. I mean, foundationally, our schools of education should be preparing educators to come into the workforce prepared to deliver in a technology context. We've got to be thinking about what are the foundational competencies and skills that our future educators are going to need, and how are we lining up the schools of education, the incentive structure that will enable that talent to flourish and that pipeline to be there for our students.
I'll just jump in for a second. I think a change like that is going to be important. It's not the type of change that you should just solve at the federal level by saying, behold, you now have this additional requirement. Because the reality is that ed schools are responding to their teachers being hired. So the way that type of change happens out there is by districts, schools having the discipline to hire qualified folks. And maybe you have a shortage and you recognize that you have to make some compromises, but maybe you hire them in a more temporary way as a result of that. But if you want to see a change like that, it's the supply and demand of where hiring happens. And that is what's going to force the hand of our ed schools and our universities on that particular front.
Okay, before we delve too deep into policymaking, I'm going to get into the next question.
Did that come off as like me touching my nose saying not it?
Spoken like a true politician.
I think from what I remember from my days on the federal beat, doesn't Congress have to have some role in what the accreditation requirement, No? I don't remember. You can't just snap your fingers and change.
You can't just snap your fingers, but there are lots of places something could happen. But at the end of the day, if you are hiring people who have those skills, or you're not hiring people who have those skills, regardless of what the congressional mandate is, regardless of the accreditation, if we see those practices happening out there, you'll start seeing policies and other things change to align with that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. So, next question. What changes in teacher support do you think are going to be needed to ramp up tech use in the schools as you've described? So it's kind of related to the question that we just answered. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the next one then. What can the new learning models? How can the new learning models take neurodiversity into account to make sure all diverse learners can succeed? And as somebody who actually has some neurodiversity, I'm really curious what you guys have to say.
Yeah, so we have been really thinking about this for all diverse learners in our schools and making sure that the redesign work and the reimagining work is happening with our special education teachers, our ESL teachers, our bilingual teachers, in all areas of all schools. And I think that so much of what we learned in our personalized learning work and the LEAP learning framework and the way that we think about learner connected and learner led, so many of those strategies are helping our diverse learners already that we actually learned a lot from our diverse learner teachers during this time. And so that collaboration has been key. I think one of the biggest changes that we've made during the pandemic, and we may have been very late to the game in this, but it's just required collaborative planning time between all diverse learner teachers as well as all general education teachers, all paraprofessionals, and then instructional coaches leading that cohort so that we're getting grade level collaboration at all times across wide and tall. And that's been really powerful to think about the designing that we are doing in our classrooms now, especially with the scaffolding in response to the learning acceleration work, because we're able to take so much of that and bring it into the work of our actual general education teachers. So we're learning opposite there, but it's been really powerful for us.
Okay.
I'm happy to jump in on that one too. I think, so this question specifically talks about neurodiversity, and to me the basic level, the low-hanging fruit to be able to address that, especially in alternate learning models, is having multiple modalities of learning. And what I mean by that is, so if your learning model is 28 kids in a room with a teacher who's sort of lecturing at them all the time, there are a set of folks who will respond to that. And that will work out with one sense of how you learn, right? But if there really is diversity in how people are processing, then having a variety of ways that the instruction is being delivered is one way that you can start to get to everybody. Now you can go to a whole other level of that and personalize and individualize further when you start understanding what different students are responding to more and how do you give them different doses of different modalities in there. But just as a basic starting point, by having group learning, project learning, more investigation activities rather than lecture activities, these afford the opportunity for students to find some method of learning that connects with them.
Okay. Let's see. What does the new normal and reimagined future look like? I think we kind of covered that. Okay. How do you get buy-in? We did cover that too a little bit. Okay. Bottom one. What are your thoughts on new and creative ways to attract and retain teachers given national shortages? So solve that problem, guys, in the next minute and a half.
So Phyllis mentioned this. We're looking at a lot of partnerships. So we're obviously going to all of our higher ed partners to get much more engaged with them so that we're stronger partners, and we're trying to recruit away as many teachers as we can. So that's goal one. Second is really thinking about alternate route teachers and folks that we can partner with through our Relay Graduate School of Education, through our Golden Apple partnership in Chicago and in Michigan, to really think about how we can get career change teachers really excited and inspired about what we're doing in new and creative ways. I also think within our schools, we're really trying to get creative about some of our best and brightest teachers that have been with us in the way that we're investing in them. Culture has been a top priority for us, but with funding right now, back to Chris's point, we're getting as creative as we can with supplanting and supplementing and being intentional about sustainable funding so that we can think about investment in teachers as we always have been, but more importantly and ever more now. But also thinking about shared teachers of record across grade levels, master teacher titles, instructional coaches from within. And so building leadership pipelines where we have teachers now asking us like, hey, we've had the substitute in this third grade classroom. Why don't I just zoom in and stream to that classroom and have the sub support classroom management? And so things that sounded crazy to us a couple of months ago or years ago are really becoming innovative and inspiring right now.
I think we're also seeing creativity in teacher teaming models and these collaborative models, recognizing that the full bounty of solving and serving every need for every single student was never fully realistic. And so how do we think about creating these teams where teachers are working in collaboration with their peers together in classrooms, supporting students across multiple modalities, targeting their specialty in a way that where they're seeing their value is really important and really exciting.
Yeah, I don't think this is simply, look, you might get some folks to stay an extra year or two by giving them a little bit more money, right? Unless we're going to fundamentally change the game of how much people are compensated for, that's just sort of a stalling tactic, in my opinion, on a lot of this. I think, not that you shouldn't pay teachers more if you can. I don't want to.
U.S. Department of Education is saying no raises for children.
Yeah, if you can, teachers deserve more. But I think, the schools I've been talking to, at the end of the day, people are leaving because they are not feeling successful, because they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling it's too much. I think you have to reimagine the role of teaching. I think you have to partner with teachers and say, I hear you. Really, truly, I do. Help me make this a place that you want to be. What needs to change and evolve with that? And you can't it can't be lip service. It needs to be sincere. You need to follow through on those things. But most teachers I know got into teaching because they wanted to make a difference, because they were passionate about it, and they're giving up because they don't feel that there's a pathway forward. Give them a pathway forward. Give them an opportunity. You can't guarantee it, but you say, do it with me. Let's see what we can do. And I think you're going to see some people really stick around to try to do it if they sense that is sincere.
All right, and on that note, thank you all so much on the panel for what a really thoughtful and insightful conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Austin.